Hello, my name is Grace Conium. I'm currently in the fourth year of my PhD, and today I just want to focus on a few particular case studies that are focusing on the non-invasive forms of community archaeology on the coast and the types of impacts that these might include for the volunteers at these sites. It works. It's good. The overall aim of my PhD when I started a couple of years ago was to try and evaluate both the short and long-term impacts of community archaeology along these coastal regions in Kent. And hopefully this would add to better understanding not only their own perceived impacts of why people were taking part, but hopefully what motivated them to take part as well. And with that greater understanding, it was hoped that the projects themselves could tap into that knowledge and hopefully contribute towards the meaningful long-term engagement, which typically these short-term funded projects might struggle with, especially towards the end of the funding period. And hopefully this would result in the generation of more archaeological information on the coast before the landscapes are lost to climate change. Which of course is one of the reasons a lot of these community archaeology along the coast are taking part. There is a recognition that these coastlines are at threat of being lost. So it's trying to find ways of encouraging more people and engaging a lot more people in order to tackle those climate challenges. So the first case study that I just want to outline is just for anyone who doesn't know where Kent is. I'm sure everyone is. It's on the southeast tip. Again, I'm sure everyone knows, but just in case. And the first case study that I want to talk to you about is called Citizen, and that stands for the Coastal and Intertidal Zone Action Network or Archaeology Network. I should have wrote it down. But it's managed by MOLA. And I will be focusing on their second phase of engagement that run from 2019 to 2022. And the overall aim of Citizen was to highlight the threats of this coastal erosion to a number of different locations in England. And they wanted to promote a standardised way of evaluating this work across 6 key sites in England, and one of those key sites was East Kent. And because of this time period did COVID, so instead of being able to engage a lot of different landscapes within the Kent region, they focused in on a particular site at Sandwich Bay. And this was initially discovered, this particular site, at the end of phase 1 when they found these random sticks sticking out of the foreshore, and nobody really knew what they was. And it was quickly discovered that they were unrecorded fish traps, post-medieval fish traps, that people didn't have them recorded. So over a session of 9 different couple of days, people were able to record, and the volunteers that they were working with, over 1,100 of these stakes that formed the fish traps, which immensely added to the knowledge of the fishing industry at this particular location. And on the top left, we can just see how people were able to record that. So Lara Band was instrumental in this work, and all the black V-shapes are the fish traps that the volunteers recorded, and that is interdispersed with other sites of interest, such as shipwrecks, which a lot of work is already happening to record at that site. But the fish traps weren't as interesting. People weren't as interested in the fish traps in comparison to the shipwrecks at these particular sites. But Lara, thankfully, was really interested. And during these really early tidal walks, people were able to record these fish traps in detail. So people would wake up very early, go to the sites and do a lot of field walking. And it was important these happened over a course of a couple of days because, of course, just because of the shifting sands, fish traps that would be visible on one day wouldn't necessarily be visible on the next day. So it was really important to go at different days across the year as well, hence the 9 different fieldwork sessions. And volunteers were involved in a number of different activities outside of the actual recording. So they also did a lot of research and helped with the report writing as well. The next case study that I would like to focus on before I get into my findings was Once and Rediscovered on Dover. And even though there was an element of bit more typical excavation at this project, there was other things that volunteers could get involved with and can get involved in because it is still underway. And the purpose of this is, of the project in general, Once and Rediscovered, it's managed by the National Trust, so we can't escape them completely in this talk, unfortunately. It was due to the recognition that some of the coastal offensive structures that were present during World War II had been covered up during the 70s, so it was reclaiming them. And the aim of the Once and Rediscovered is to preserve and make accessible some of these sites as well. And some of the things that volunteers could get involved with that are maybe non-intrusive graffiti surveys, and this is every piece of graffiti across the site, which is pretty extensive, and also, again, managed vegetation that we've spoken a bit about today, as well as research and tours of the site when it's open to the public. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, the overall aim of my research is to evaluate the short and long-term impacts, and how I've decided to do that is through semi-structured interviews, as well as something called participant observation, so watching people with their consent. And once I've got this information, I did something called thematic analysis, which I'll explain more about in the next slide, and it was processed using a software called Vivo. Throughout the two case studies that I've mentioned, there were a total of 28 volunteers that I interviewed, and if you see any quotes, they are all pseudonyms, so there won't be any names present here, that they're real names. So with the thematic analysis, once I've got all my data, all of the interview transcripts, thematic analysis is a way of taking all of that data and trying to identify the themes that are present, so what people are talking about, and seeing if there are similarities across the data set. And once I identified the themes, you can kind of group them into main themes with subcategories. So in regards to the impacts of community archaeology, according to the volunteers, I was able to split these up into 4 different main groups. So you've got the volunteer impacts, so people that they saw internalised, so things that they thought were impacting themselves. There's also community impacts. Community impacts. So things to do with the wider projects or the local people around them. Impacts for the natural environment, as well as the heritage environment. And I'm just going to go, one by one, and just explore them a bit more in detail now. So the volunteer impacts. This had the most different types of examples, and it was quoted most frequently by the various volunteers across both of the sites. And these were incredibly multifaceted, and people were very able to talk about the impacts of the community archaeology when referencing the impacts towards themselves. The social connections were very apparent. People saw this as an opportunity to meet new people, and as well as engage in their friends. Health and well-being, which I'm glad we've already spoken about today. It's interesting that, again, people are willing to talk about their own health and well-being experiences, which was really interesting. Personal development, so things like skill generation and knowledge generation. Positive experiences after retirement. I think this potentially reflects the demographic of the typical volunteer that was present at both of these sites, which is interesting because I think one person described it as like filling the void. There was this real recognition that there was this hole in their life, and volunteering provided that opportunity for them to be able to carry on living in a world that was completely changed from how it looked a couple of years ago, and as well as fostering a connection to the local area. What was interesting about this is at Sandwich Bay, there was more people coming from other areas outside of East Kent, and they were able to relate their experiences back to where they were from originally and to do with that fishing heritage. Whereas at Dover, most of them were local and they didn't necessarily know about the history of the site before they started volunteering. And just the comments here, Bronte, not her real name. So what I find really interesting about Bronte's case is when you look at what she's talking about, saying that she's more confident and how she was really scared of being in contact. This is someone that's borderline agoraphobic before they started engaging with this particular project. And she then related this to, I think she was at the hospital a couple of weeks ago before this interview took place, and she had a conversation with a stranger, which lots of people wouldn't necessarily think twice about, but she really thought that this was a change of experience for her life. So it really highlights the really significant impacts that this has on people's everyday lives outside of the projects. And Bob talks about his practical skills, and not only from these traditional top-down methods from the project and the managers teaching them, but also from the volunteers themselves. So recognizing that there are other volunteers who have a lot of skills outside of the project and are able to learn from them. And there was a really interesting experience that I saw. Someone had bought their sewing machine from them because they knew someone else wanted to learn how to sew. So these skills and developments aren't necessarily confined to the projects themselves, and it allows greater collaboration, and it fosters people's ability to be able to learn experiences that are completely irrelevant to the actual project, but really relevant to the lives that people are experiencing outside of the project. And in regards to the next section about the impacts of the wider community, both within the volunteer group as well as outside, we're mainly surrounded about the changing attitudes that these projects fostered. So one of them is changed attitudes towards gender stereotypes, where Bella she was trained to use this piece of equipment, I need to say, but she was using this piece of equipment in order to do some grass management. And I remember when she volunteered to do it, there was hesitation amongst the group because she was a younger individual and she was a woman, and there was a bit of hesitation, but she did it. And I think she reflects on this during her interview and the fact that she not only showed the other people, but she also showed herself. And the other people in the group, they were verbally impressed by her doing this. So it has these opportunities to change those kind of gender stereotypes that potentially are entrenched in the people that are taking part. And also it has the opportunity to change age stereotypes as well. So Bess was speaking about her experiences, and when a particular group was being shown around, that were just visitors to the site, she was sweeping, which again, lots of people wouldn't necessarily consider. But Bess had been retired for a number of years, and she wasn't the only person that expressed these feelings of being ignored in her everyday life. But by doing and volunteering in these sites, people can feel useful and feel like they're contributing. So it really has the ability to change people's perception of people who are maybe post-retirement. The third theme that was expressed by the volunteers relates to the natural environment and impacts to the natural environment. These sites are located on the coast, and it really has the potential to not only conserve the natural landscapes, but also has the potential to foster conservation and action against climate change. So Andre, who was working at the Citizen project, says that by actually engaging within the works with Citizen, he felt like he was doing something useful in terms of climate change. And a lot of the time when we speak about climate change, it can often leave people quite disillusioned and quite confused about where to go. So by actually engaging in these projects, it can potentially allow people to feel like they're doing something useful to combat the actions of climate change. And Brent as well, who was working at Dover, again, is along the line of agreeing with the projects that they're working with and seeing them as useful in terms of conserving the natural landscape, in this case through the path that exists through the White Cliffs at Dover. And finally, the impacts for the heritage environment. So people, when asked what are the impacts of this particular project, there were often conversations around how it would contribute towards the historical knowledge of the projects that they were working with. So this wasn't just in regards to the actual preservation of the heritage, but it was also through things like written material by the volunteers themselves. A couple of them had written books even, or written blogs. So this is a real way of demonstrating that they don't necessarily have to be part of the actual preserving, but they can also add to that knowledge body as well. As well as increasing volunteers in other archaeological projects. Again, we've spoken about in the Trading Chalk, like trying to get them involved in other projects to ensure that longevity. So by just simply being involved in these projects, they then become aware of everything else that is happening in and around them. And again, Ben was talking about the graffiti survey that he was involved with. And as I mentioned, because we were recording every bit of graffiti, he thought this was of particular significance because what we didn't necessarily consider important today might be considered significant in the future. So he, again, really agreed with the types of things they were doing in order to conserve that information for future generations. So, in conclusion, the perceived impacts for volunteers engaging within these community archaeology are clearly very multifaceted and potentially very significant for the individuals taking part. The next stages of my PhD are to do with further analysis, so trying to identify the differences in each groups to see how they compare against each other. And hopefully this will add to the generation of meaningful long-term engagement, so the recording of this information has greater opportunities to continue past the point of the funding period. Thank you.